Good morning, everyone. I'll ask you all to take your seats. Welcome to CSIS. I'm Johanna Nesseth. I'm Vice President for Strategic Planning, and I head up our work on global food security here at CSIS. We're very pleased today to have a chance to talk about something that probably doesn't get talked about a whole lot in a great deal of depth in Washington, and that's the role of fertilizer and phosphate in food security. It's sort of a technical conversation, so we want to bridge both the technical and some of the policy pieces today. And we're having this opportunity because IFDC, International Fertilizer Development Center, is releasing a report right now, which you've got in front of you, on an estimate of world phosphate rock reserves and resources. And Amit will tell us more about why they took on this study, but they're trying to look at the question of peak phosphate, whether we're running out of phosphate, we're going to run out of a core material for fertilizer, and whether that's going to affect global food security. The answer I will reveal to you right now is no. Not in the near future, but we need to really focus on efficiency and focus on using resources more carefully for a number of reasons. We have a wonderful panel of experts today, and we're going to try to go from sort of big picture down to more technical and then come back a little bit again. Ann Tutwiler is the coordinator for global food security at USDA. She works very closely with Secretary Vilsack and advising him on how USDA can play a primary role, a very important role in the Feed the Future initiative. Ann has a long history of working in ag markets and ag development and has been a good partner with CSIS for many, many reasons and for many years. She's also been closely affiliated with IFDC, served as a member of their board. And we've asked Ann to really set the stage for us, talk about food security, talk about hunger, talk about productivity and fertilizer's role there. Amit Roy is the president of IFDC, and he has a long, long history at IFDC. Has done a number of things. You've got his bio there, and he's going to just lay out some of the reasons why IFDC took on this report and the importance of talking about these reserves. And then he'll get into a bit more detail with Steve Van Kouwenberg, who is the author of the report and extremely knowledgeable about mining techniques and reserves and approaches, and he will lay out some of the key findings. And then Dr. Terry Roberts, who's the president of International Plant Nutrition Institute, is going to bring us back a little bit and really talk about what fertilizer does for plant productivity, why it's important. And I think to put this on sort of an imaginable scale, the way I think about fertilizer tends to be less technical. Having spent a lot of time on a farm in the Midwest, it's so obvious what fertilizer does when you take a look at a field and you see that little strip of plants that was missed by fertilizer, and you see these scrawny little yellow, weak, short plants standing next to those plants that were hit by fertilizer, that are tall and green and strong and obviously able to produce so much more. And this is on black, fertile Midwestern soil. Imagine weak, poor, sapped out soil in Africa and other places that can barely produce, and without additional fertilizer can really struggle to produce levels of food that are appropriate to feed the farmers and feed the families around them. It's an incredible input. It's an incredibly important input for our global food production. It's important for the developed world. As we look to feed a world of 9 billion people, we need ways to increase levels of production. And it's also incredibly important for the developing world in terms of raising more food for small farmers to feed their families and those around them. So we appreciate you joining us today. We're really looking forward to hearing more about the report. And I'm going to turn it over to Ann, if you would start. And I think your presentation is right here. You can just pull it up.
Nope, not that one. They're all, there it is. Okay. So first I'd like to thank Joanna for inviting me to be here and say a few words of commendation for CSIS and the work that they've been doing in the ag food security arena for the last, 2 or 3 years. And I think, one of the things that I think has been really terrific about their work is not only the quality of it, which has been quite high as one would expect, but I think it has also gotten the issue of food security and agriculture kind of out of the Aggie techie world and into a broader context of how food security relates to international security. I remember a meeting I attended very early on of this group in a previous life, and there were a number of people from the military there. And I think just being able to expand this debate has been a huge contribution of CSIS. I want to also commend IFDC. I know I was on the board, and it was more than a year ago that I resigned, so just putting that out there. But I want to commend them for this report, which I did have a chance to skim. And just to say that I had a dinner with some people in the fertilizer industry when I was at an international meeting a few weeks ago who were talking about this report and the impact it would have. So I just want to say that I think it is much anticipated and is going to help address some debate that has been going on in the fertilizer world, and IFDC's high quality of their technical work, I think, certainly will commend this report to a lot of people who have these worries, as you say, about our ability to continue to increase our productivity. So let me just ask a quick question. How many of you are familiar with the Feed the Future initiative? Okay. So I'm not going to spend any time talking about this slide except to give you an update on some of the status of what we've been doing. We have been working with developing countries, the 20 target countries, candidate countries, to develop their country plans. We've now reviewed actually more than 20 plans that have been produced by Rwanda, Bangladesh, Ghana, a number of West African countries, Haiti, and looking at those plans for their technical quality and implementation capacity. We've had high-level meetings reviewing those plans with senior officials from the governments and from the donor community. USAID is taking the lead in developing U.S. government strategies to align with those country plans, and we're in the process now in a whole-of-government manner of reviewing all of those strategies as we start deciding how we're going to be actually spending money on the ground. We've had 2 deputy coordinators named for the Feed the Future initiative, one sitting at state and one sitting at USAID, and the coordinator, we hope, will be named sometime soon. We have launched a research strategy under the auspices of what we're calling the Borlaug Research Initiative, which is a joint research strategy with USAID, and we are in the process of aligning USDA's resources to the extent that we can with the International Food Security Initiative and working with USAID on some joint programming of research funds. So I think some of this progress is a little bit of process, but given sort of where we were starting with that, with sort of nothing, I think we've come a long way. So I think all of you are aware of the food security challenge that we face, and even though the FAO just announced that the total number of hungry people in the world has declined from just about 1 billion to around 850 million, that's still A, quite unacceptable number, but B, a lot of that decline was because global food prices declined in the face of the recession. And as some folks say, trading off high prices for a recession is really not the trade-off that we want to make as a society. The World Bank has just issued numbers citing the number of extremely poor people as having gone up as a result of the recession to about 1.4 billion. So this is still a tremendous problem, even if the numbers in the past year are trending down. And we certainly see the continued skittishness among policymakers in response to the Russian wheat harvest, for example, where the Russians have instituted an export ban, even in the face of what everyone says are pretty ample wheat supplies. So I think this issue is still in the back of the mind of policymakers is there going to be enough food, and is it going to be produced in the places that need it? So I want to start by just talking quickly about the importance of agriculture in both economic growth in developing countries, but also in poverty reduction. For developing countries, the multiplier effect of agriculture growth is about 3 to 1. So that is for every dollar you put in a farmer's pocket of income, they generate $3 of additional economic activity in rural areas by buying fertilizer, by buying seeds, by transporting their products. So it's a very powerful engine of economic growth. But this graph, which is a little complicated, also indicates that it's particularly efficient means of economic growth and poverty reduction for the poorest of the poor. So that circle is around the lowest end of the income scale, so the 20th and 10th percentile on the income scale. And it indicates that really agriculture is, it says 2 to 4 times more powerful than non-ag growth in terms of reducing poverty among that most vulnerable group. So getting agriculture more productive is certainly what we see as a key to alleviating both extreme poverty but also food insecurity. Yet, despite this, this recognition, this is a graph of the overall development assistance that has been going to the ag sector over the last 40 years, really. And if you look at this graph, it peaked just after the 73 food price spikes, where again, this issue was on people's radar screens, and had declined. So it was up about 14% of overall overseas development assistance, and it has declined to about 4% up until 2007. And I think while this is just overseas development assistance, I think this also mirrors what has happened in the developing world as governments in the developing world have emphasized other issues, health, education, urban development, over agriculture. Their spending in this area has also declined, and in part because of the signals that have been given by the donor community about the importance of ag. Now, these numbers, they're moving up, and part of the idea behind the Feed the Future initiative was to put the focus on getting the donor community and the governments, developing country governments, back into the ag sector. If any of you who are econometricians see some slight resemblance between the graph I just showed and these, the overall decline in yields in developing countries over the main cereals, I don't think it's entirely coincidental. Obviously, this is not just caused by lower development assistance, but it contributed to the fact that developing countries and the international community were not putting money into research, not putting money into extension, into rural roads, into rural communities. So one of the things that is important to note here is, one, we need to get these numbers back up because of the global food security issues, but two, improving the productivity of farmers' lands, of their labor and their capital inputs is critically important to getting the income of farmers up in the developing world. And I think that's where the fertilizer issues come in. So we often get pretty pessimistic about the possibilities for increasing output when we see sort of the dire statistics in Africa in particular, but we can see in other parts of the developing world that there is opportunity to increase yields. This is not just a pipe dream of people who are hoping to achieve some results, but you can see that in Asia have been tremendous growth in yields over the past several decades as a result of the Green Revolution. And there's no reason that parts of Africa can't replicate this with the right levels of inputs, the right levels of investment. Sorry, wrong way. So this is another graph, which I don't know if IFDC had some hand in developing this data, but this is also just to give an indication that there is a strong potential in developing countries, in particular in Africa, to increase yields. And these are actual farms in the orange. So these are not test model farms. These are actual farms which applied the appropriate amounts of fertilizer, seeds, other technology, and farm management compared to the green levels, which is the average farm yields in those countries. So it's trying to demonstrate that this is an achievable goal to increase productivity in a number of developing countries. This gives a little bit of an indication of how the fertilizer consumption has been trending over the last, again, 4 or 5 decades. You can see a very rapid increase in the growth in developing countries. Use of fertilizer, most of that is in Asia. And you can also see a huge drop in fertilizer consumption in the transition economies, mainly Russia, after the decline of the Soviet Union and really the end of fertilizer subsidies in that part of the world. So this gives you a better indication of what's happening in different parts of the world. The very light green line at the bottom of the chart is African fertilizer consumption. As you can see, it is completely flat since the early 1960s and is at the level really that Asia was at before the start of the Green Revolution. The Asia numbers are particularly high here, in part because we see a lot of double and triple cropping, but I think the main point of this slide is really the flatness of the African fertilizer investment. So this is the chart that I don't know that many of you have seen. This was produced by one of the Economic Research Services experts, and it goes back and tries to demonstrate what are the sources of agricultural productivity. And so fertilizer is the blue at the top of this scale. So according to his research, in the decades of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you saw fertilizer being a fairly significant contributor to ag productivity. You see the drop between 1990 and 99 because in large part of the decline I just showed you in the transition economies. And when you take that out and come back to 2000, 2007, you still see a very significant role that fertilizer is playing in, and this is global ag productivity growth. And I think this is important for a couple of reasons. One, it really gives us a sense that this is an important part of the mix as we approach how we're going to increase food production and decrease food insecurity in developing countries. But I want to call attention to the orange bar, which is the increase in total factor productivity, which, if you're not an economist, basically what that means is how are you utilizing your land, your labor, your capital. And this, the gentleman who produced this graph, points out, this is research, this is extension, this is knowledge management, knowledge transfer, all of which have to be part of a system in which you are introducing fertilizer. And I'm going to stop there. I've got a couple of more slides, but I'm going to stop there. There has been a big debate, and I know IFDC has been at the center of this debate, around the utility of fertilizer subsidies to get the sector going, and I have a couple of slides on that I won't pull out. But I think the real point is back to this chart, which is, fertilizer subsidies and jump-starting that market, is not is necessary to do in some way, shape, or form, but you have to put the fertilizer in the context of a broader system where you are increasing extension, increasing markets, and this is something I know IFDC is doing, and I think when we in the U.S. government are looking at the role of fertilizer, it's in that broader systemic concept, not just, can we get the increase in the fertilizer application rate up. It's all of the things that go around that we're trying to work on. So with that, thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Anne. That's very helpful. And a great stage setter to turn to you, Dr. Roy, to tell us a little bit more about the background on the study.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I want to thank CSIS for hosting this event, and particularly because of the recent debate that has gone on regarding the phosphate issues. Anne has given a very good overview in terms of ag productivity and the role of fertilizers. So I'm not going to make too many comments on that other than to say that over the last 3 years, the whole area of access to fertilizer, particularly in developing country, has intensified and it has brought the world attention. What I would like to do this morning is just to give you a little one snapshot of what IFDC is for those of you who may not know the institution. This was established in 1974 during the World Food Crisis and the meeting that happened in Rome. This was suggested by then US Secretary of State Dr. Kissinger, and it was supported by the government of Australia and Canada. And in 1977, President Carter gave us international immunities and privilege as an international organization. So in the United States, we enjoy the same privileges as the World Bank and the United Nations. We are a public nonprofit organization, and our initial focus was to help developing countries solve food deficit problem with focus on fertilizer-related issue, particularly new types of fertilizer, as also the more efficient use of it. Over the year, the institution has diversified. We now look at the whole issue of soil fertility and ag development and look at fertilizer in the context of overall food productivity and looking at the efficiency of both delivery and use at the farm level. Our particular focus has been and continues to be in terms of the raw material identification and assessment. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, micronutrient, these are critical elements required for food production, and we put a lot of emphasis of our work on those items. With that, we also focus on developing efficient markets and ag inputs, developing capacity, and finally the policy issue that needs to go along with it. Now, why did we undertake this study? I put this graph up to show you the price trend that has happened since 2004 up until now, and we all know about the spike in cost of the cereal, the major cereal, rice, wheat, maize, and also superimpose that with the price of oil as well. And the consequence of those, certainly the prices going up on one hand, led to food riots, which we are all aware of what happened in 2008, 2009. And then looking at the price of fertilizers, I mean, there was some, up until about 2007, the price of delivered fertilizers or the price of international price of fertilizers remained relatively constant. And in fact, in constant dollar, it was going down. But then suddenly, there are several factors that contributed to the spike in cost of fertilizers. And there are several events that happened that led to it. Crop failure being one of them. The price of energy went up. The supply and demand didn't keep. There was more demand than supply. Then mandated biofuel, that also took significant amount of fertilizer. So combination of factors resulted in very, very high prices. And of course, that affected many of the developing countries. I always use an example of the impact of these high prices using India. As you know, India has a very large subsidy bill on fertilizers. And in 2008, 2009, their subsidy bill on fertilizer alone was $22 billion, which was very close to their defense budget. So that was a very important aspect of it. The fertilizer prices suddenly came down because of the economic reasons, and now we see inching up of the prices, and particularly the phosphate prices. So the price of commodities went up, the fertilizer being one of them, and then the whole issue of access to input, access to fertilizers. Phosphate is one of the three nutrient essential for plant growth, the others being nitrogen and potassium. Phosphate, is a finite resource. We mine phosphate rock and produce fertilizers from it. And over the last year and a half, there has been numerous articles suggesting that the world is going to run out of phosphate. Now, this is not the first time it has happened, and Van Kornberg is going to give you a little rundown of some of the studies that have been done in the past. We have had this situation in 1971 when people came out, we're going to run out of phosphate by the end of the century, and we are not going to have anything left. And there again, there has been this whole idea of running out of phosphate. It happens, looks like, every 20, 25 years. So that was another reason. And we, as an institution, maintain a very exhaustive phosphate rock database. We have chemical, mineralogical information, which we have actually done over 1,000 samples of phosphate rock. And we have a huge database of phosphate deposits around the world. We also have samples, and it is a very dynamic system that we keep updated. So given that, we felt it was very necessary for we as an institution to put some thoughts in based on published information and information that were within the public domain, to put together a study to actually give you an idea of what the phosphate reserves and resources are. There is always this dynamic movement between reserve and resources based on the prices, and certainly we wanted to take a look at that as well. So that, as a background, is what we undertook this study. And this is a study which started in 2009. It was funded by USAID, and Van Kornberg is going to go and give more detail about how this study was done. All of you have a copy of the report that has been released today. And if you ask Van Kornberg, this was a one-year study, but we only gave him 9 months to complete it. So that's what he has done. Thank you very much. Thanks, John.
Well, without further ado, Steve, why don't you join us at the podium and tell us about the study and what you found.
Hopefully I can be as succinct as possible. Click to exit. Okay, where's the little icon here? Every one of these is different. Yeah, on there, I think. No, that's Amit. Sorry. That's it.
Thank you, Kristen.
First off, I'd like to thank Dr. Roy for allowing me to do this. I was supervising engineers for 17, 18 years at IFDC, and this allowed me to concentrate on maybe 2 or 3 things rather than 20 or 30. And that was good. Numerous articles suggested we were going to run out of reserves resources of phosphate rock in the 21st century. When I started this study, I want to admit that I thought there might be a real problem. I really did. And I started with the attitude I was probably looking for a problem. These are several articles that mention running out of phosphate rock. There's a lot of literature running around on the internet. There's been numerous articles since this time in 2010. But this is not the first time the Institute of Ecology had a seminar in 1971, and they published a paper, a volume, and they said we were going to run out of rock, phosphate rock, in 90 to 130 years. This is from some of the more recent articles. This is the peak phosphorus curve. This is based on Hubbard peak theory. M. King Hubbard was a engineer, actually, I believe. a petroleum engineer, and he published this in 1955, and it was an attempt to estimate when we would run out of oil in the United States. And the theories about when you get to half of the reserves, you go over this peak, and then you inexplicably come down. King Hubbard used a parabola for his curve. This is a normal curve, actually. And basically what it says in the articles, it says that we will peak in 2033 to 2034, and after that we will go downhill based on some kind of modeling. This is the actual, I think, caption from the figure. And Mr. Jasinski, he's from the USGS and European Fertilizer Manufacturers Association. I want you to know that they don't publish the kind of detailed data that allows you to calculate phosphate or phosphorus production like that. All of these articles rely on USGS data for the reserve and resource estimates. A phosphate rock is from two sources, mainly sedimentary and igneous. There's a third classification called metamorphic phosphate rock, which is sedimentary or igneous rock that's been squeezed and subjected to pressure and heat. They're composed of apatite. The sedimentary apatite is a carbonate apatite. The igneous apatite, igneous means fire formed, and they're the fluorochlorohydroxyl apatite variety. They're about 42% P2O5 when they're pure, and the sedimentary ones can range from about 34 to 42% P2O5. Apatite is named after the Greek goddess of deceit, guile, fraud, and deception. And she was released from Pandora's box, which I always thought was interesting. But it looks like many things. In the upper left, there's a hexagonal crystal of apatite from Sri Lanka. You're looking down the C-axis. That in the middle there is a nodule from Tahuan, Niger. Dulong bone, an ancestral manatee. It's made out of phosphate. Shark's teeth are bones. Ancestral, lower left, ancestral somatolites that are about Precambrian in age from India, nodules from Morocco, and then most of the phosphate rock that we use today looks like the sandy phosphate rock in the dish down at the bottom there. Phosphate rock deposits are found all over the world. The igneous deposits are little squares on this diagram. I think I did this in about 1990, and it's probably the most reproduced IFDC figure ever, and I think I need to do it over again. Igneous deposits are generally found in cratonic areas or rift zones like the East African Rift Zone. Sedimentary deposits are usually found on a continental shelf or associated with a former continental shelf, and they may be Precambrian to recent in age. Global phosphate rock production hit about 160 million tons in 2008. The last time it did this was 1987, 1988. This figure is in some dispute. This is the USGS figures, a little over 160 million tons. The International Fertilizer Manufacturers Association figure is over 170, and they have slightly different sources of data. So we mine all this rock. What do we use it for? 72%, according to Ken Neary, goes to phosphoric acid. According to IFA, about 74% goes to phosphoric acid. 12% is SSP, 2% triple super, and 14% for other uses. Out of that total P2O5, 82% goes for fertilizer. And when they make fertilizer, the losses range from 2 to 15%, but basically it's about 5% using best available technology. This is just the relationship of rock to fertilizer. Most of the rock these days is processed with sulfuric acid, SSP, make this wet process phosphoric acid, and they have a byproduct gypsum. For every ton of P2O5, you get 5 tons of gypsum. And then the over 50% of the fertilizer used in the world is monoammonium phosphate, diammonium phosphate, or triple superphosphate, which is all made from wet process phosphoric acid usually. And then there are nitrophosphates, which are mainly used in Europe. Here I've graphed world phosphate rock production. And this is just on a tonnage basis. showing it gone over last year, over 160 million tons. And what I wanted to show you here was several things. That little black line there, the R squared factor there says that line is no good. But I put it on there anyway. And what it shows is over 28 years of data, growth has been less than 1% a year, really, in the phosphate rock business. Certain things happened back in the late 80s, early 90s. The Soviet Union dissolved, and that seriously affected internal demand in the Soviet Union associated countries. And there's been numerous dips. There's all kinds of trends there. There's trends up and down, but basically it's only grown about 1% per year over the last 28 years. Various production from various countries here. You'll notice Russia really dipped back around 1990. United States, from peaks and back in the 80s, has slowly gone down. Morocco has gone up ever so slightly. China increased their production incredible levels. When I first got into this business, they were maybe at about 15 million tons a year, and now the claims are somewhere going to be 40 or over even 50 million tons a year. Has there been a continuous decrease in phosphate rock quality as the high-grade reserves and high-quality rocks have been depleted? And I've been hearing this for years and years and years and years. And the answer is yes and no. Back in the 80s, all of a sudden, very low-grade rock was produced. But starting somewhere, in the mid-90s to 2000, all of a sudden, the rock of slightly higher grade, 31%, which is probably used for phosphoric acid. I haven't broken this out by country, and I'm not going to do that. I can't tell you which country it's from. But actually, rock hasn't really gone down. I mean, the really high-grade stuff from several sedimentary deposits have been depleted, and then there was a lot of rock in Russia that wasn't produced anymore as there was no demand for it internally. It's been a low-value bulk commodity, and Dr. Roy showed this slide, and fertilizer prices went up precariously in 2008, but they'd been edging up for several years, and then they went down, and they didn't come back down to where they were, certainly. And what happened with that, too, is phosphate rock kind of got in short supply here. Back in the 80s and 90s and even into the 2000s, you could buy North African phosphate rock for $50 a ton or so. And now it went up with fertilizer, phosphate fertilizer, and now it's hovering around $100 a ton or more. The same can be said for Middle Eastern rock. And whatever, it's not as cheap as it used to be. I went into this study, and there were various goals here. We're going to review all the literature. We're going to look at the past reserve resource estimates, and I didn't look at all of them, but the most significant ones, at least in my opinion. We're going to look at how it's mined and beneficiated, and we're going to make a preliminary estimate. And I want to stress this is a preliminary estimate because really the only way you can do this is if you have all the data, and the only people who have the data are the people who own the deposits and produce the deposits. What I found with the literature review was it was very limited since the early 1990s. Basically, there was an International Geologic Correlation Program, 156 phosphorites, and they did a lot of work, and they brought a lot of people together. And after that, it's very, very, very hard to find any kind of literature concerned with phosphate deposits. A lot of information on websites, trade magazines, conference papers, and papers with very limited distribution that probably weren't even distributed to the public. Reserve resource terminology is not standardized. I'm going to run through this quick. This is a god-awful, tedious slide. But these are various estimates. Donald Emig worked for Monsanto. He had degrees in civil, mining, engineering, and he had a degree in geology. he took great exception to the Institute Ecology report, and he said there was 1.2 trillion tons of reserves. I'm not sure about his terminology. Wells did another independent study after the Institute of Ecology report, and he took exception with it, and he said there was 530 billion tons of reserves at 30% P2O5. Devoto and Stevens worked for the U.S. Department of Energy, and this was actually focused on uranium and phosphate rock, and they had numerous categories and excluded lands and things, and they estimated the recoverable product around the world was 265 billion tons, and they didn't have much information on countries other than what was considered the free world at that time, and they didn't have a lot of data for the Middle East or Africa really either. Cathcart was the geologist assigned the Florida phosphate deposits for years, and he was very conservative. He said about at that time there's about 20 billion tons of reserves that greater or equal to 30% P2O5. Fantel, they worked for the U.S. U.S. Bureau of Mines, and they used the term estimated recoverable product around the world of 37 billion tons, but what they talked about is how incomplete the data was for the rest of the world. Notholt, Sheldon, and Davidson are the culmination of the IGCP project, and they talked about resources, and they came up with 163 billion tons, and they actually had a P2O5 content listed at 22.5%. This is the last USGS estimate of reserves and the last estimate of a reserve base, and the last time I can find this listed and with numbers on it about how much these things cost, how much the phosphate rock was worth or how much it could be produced at, was 1993. At 15 billion tons, originally when they gave these numbers, it was produced at a cost of less than $40 a ton, and the reserve base was less than $100 a ton, and that hasn't been listed since about 1995, and now the USGS is not listing reserve bases for any other commodities. They've discontinued that last year. What do we find out about mining beneficiation recovery? Economic means very large scale. A small phosphate mine is 1.5 million tons to 2 million tons, and they get bigger from there. Beneficiation, simple as possible. Generally, if they can mine it and ship it, that's fine. They dedust it, but they screen it. They screen it dry if possible, and then they wash it if they have water, or frost flotation was employed in the U.S. in the 20s and 30s, but it hasn't been used in the Middle East or North Africa except for about the last 15 years or less. I redefined reserves and resources and tried to use a much simpler definition than given by other authors at times. Reserves are rock that can be produced economically at the time of the determination to make suitable products. And I reported it in tons of concentrate. All of these reports are jumbled with concentrate and ore numbers. Resources, they're rocks of any grade that may be produced sometime in the future, including reserves, and I back calculated, or I gave the reserves as tons of rock in the ground because they hadn't been produced. These are the rock reserves as published in the U.S. Bureau of Mines, USGS Mineral Commodity Summaries. Congress voted the Bureau of Mines closed, I think, in 1995 or 96. 95, and it was closed by March of 1996. So before mid-90s or so, this was all U.S. Bureau of Mines data, and then it switched over to the USGS. And the U.S. Bureau of Mines had a rather large staff, and they had lots of economists and mining engineers on staff, and they did rather detailed studies. But what you notice, and this is a lot of quantum leaps in terms of reserves, you'll notice, though, that the United States keeps plugging along there just over a billion tons of reserves. Other countries have gone up and down. There was not much data out of China until after the year 2000, and all of a sudden they had more phosphate rock than anyone in the world. And then in 2009 and 2010, this got revised. There's not much data coming out of China. Morocco, back in the 80s, there's about 7 billion tons there, and it got revised down to less than 6 and revised a little. South Africa got revised in about 1999 or so, 1998. I tried to use original or most current literature, other sources, and what I try to do is go back where somebody did some work. And what do I mean by that? Somebody drilled some holes in the ground and they pulled cores or chips or something out, and they did chemistry and they found intervals, and then they mapped out the deposits and they did volume estimates. They did bulk densities on the material in situ, and they tried to figure out how much they had, and then they actually did economic calculations to figure out they could produce it and make money, a profit at that time. I assume 95% mining recovery, and that should read for open pits, and that's general figure. I've talked to a lot of mine managers over the years and consultants. Underground, there's different ratios of recovery. It's in the book there. I look for ore to concentrate ratios. How much ore did you have to put in the plant to make concentrate? And these are very hard numbers to find, and you go through a lot of literature. I've got 5 pages of references on this thing, but I can assure you I looked at thousands of documents. And then I calculated the reserves as product, and I calculated the resources in terms of raw materials because they're still in the ground and technology might change. And here's what I came up with. I came up with 60 billion tons of reserves as product, and this is product that can be used to make fertilizer. It's the typical product that comes from whatever deposit, and there's a table in the book there on a country-by-country basis, and then you can go back in the sections for individual countries. I didn't make this a cookbook, but somebody who has a reasonable knowledge of this, I think they can go back and they can see how I did this. And I came up with a preliminary resource estimate of 290 billion tons, and there's all kinds of speculation because there's a lot more phosphate rock out there that people still haven't explored for. So I want to make a few points here. Reserves are dynamic. They're not fixed. We don't know where all this stuff is. They're established on technology. Technology changes. Technology hasn't changed a lot in the past 25, 30 years in some places, but it has in some places around the world. They recover more rock and they produce beds and things that they did not produce before because they've implemented some of this technology and they've spent the money, made the investment to put in flotation plants or provide water for froth flotation and beneficiation plants. Reserves are established with a lot of study and considerable manpower. It takes rooms full of engineers. We have computers now, but you have to go through and you have to drill the holes and you have to have chemists and you have to get the data and you have to do a lot of calculations and then you have to involve economists. You have multi-discipline teams. You have mining engineers who are basically economists now, and they have to do a lot of work. And reserves are established generally on a planning horizon, 15, 20 years or longer for a fertilizer plant. I mean, producers do not establish reserves for hundreds of years in the future. They do it down the road a couple decades maybe. In some countries, in the Middle East and North Africa, they know they're going to be producing rock for the next 50 to 100 years or longer. So they've built plants and things that are very substantial, and they've seen these long-term things happening. But in general, in particular in the United States, and whatever they establish these reserves because they have other looming problems where they might be put out of business for a variety of reasons, and they just don't spend the time and money to extend this way out into the future. So reserves are dynamic. Everybody should remember that. They can change for a variety of reasons. Phosphate rock is a finite, non-renewable resource. And I want you to know that we believe at IFDC that we should do everything we could to preserve it and utilize it as effectively as possible and recycle it because it is a finite, non-renewable resource. There's only so much out there. Reserves are a dynamic quantity. There are more reserves than some studies indicate. This needs further study. I'm one person, and I've been doing this for a long time, and I've kind of piled up a lot of things. I have like 2 offices where one office is nothing but information and filing cabinets and things. But really the data must come from those people who actually own the deposits or control the deposits, and this really hasn't been done, and they haven't talked about this for a long time for a variety of reasons. I don't see any indication of any peak phosphorus, and certainly, you know, if there's much phosphate rock around, and the fact that it's a dynamic quantity, I don't see that happening. I mean, Hubbard peak theory was applied to oil, and I just don't necessarily see it as being appropriate to phosphorus or phosphate rock. We should recover as much of this as possible. When reminding at times in the past, various producers have not recovered as much as possible because they were competing on an economic basis with our producers, and they just simply had to be sustainable, which is make a profit and pay for their people. Some ways to recover and utilize products or phosphate rock might be alternative products. Utilize low-grade rock to make a variety of different products. We've gone to this movement, phosphoric acid and high analysis products, and at least at IFDC, our goal is to make fertilizer available at the lowest possible cost. The end. Thank you.
Well, it's obvious you've done a tremendous amount of work and a lot of research and digging, and I think this is clearly going to be a very valuable contribution. So thank you for your comments. And Dr. Roberts, we'd like to have you talk, I know your presentation is going to talk some about what fertilizer actually does in terms of productivity and plant growth, so we'll look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Joanna. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. I appreciate the invitation, and I was asked to really talk more about the agronomic side of phosphorus fertilizer and why we use it and what it is used for. And before we do that, I just need to spend a moment and introduce who our institute is. The International Plant Nutrition Institute's a non-for-profit scientific organization. We were created and established in 2007 from the Potash and Phosphate Institute. Now, PPI had been around since the mid-1920s, so we have a long history, even though we're a very small organization. We currently have agronomic programs in North and South America, Africa, throughout Asia and Oceania. We've got about 30 PhD-level scientists that work. We have a mission to develop and promote scientific information about the responsible use of plant nutrients. We are funded primarily by the world's fertilizer industry. So we provide a unified scientific voice for the fertilizer industry, which is independent of the industry. We're a scientific organization. We develop information. We support research different places around the world. So with that by way of introduction as to who we are, I just want to pick up on some of the things that were already said. As was already pointed out, fertilizer is very essential and critical to crop production. And this particular graphic gives you an idea of the relationship between total fertilizer use and cereal production over the last 5 decades. How that as cereal production increases, fertilizer use goes up. And it's critical to the growth of cereals. You may ask how much yield is actually directly attributed to fertilizer, and there's been a variety of studies that have looked at that. One of these from the American Society of Agronomy, a paper published a few years ago, looking at long-term studies about the response of crops in relation to fertilizer. And these long-term studies have the ability to integrate weather, climate, different stresses that appear in a crop. Anyway, the bottom line is that these studies have shown that some 40 to 60% of crop response is due to commercial fertilizer. So in other words, without the use of fertilizer, we'd be producing probably half as much grain in the world as we currently are able to produce. So it is essential to producing grain. Now, I just want to share a couple of slides with you about world's fertilizer consumption, how much fertilizer is being sold and used by crops. Steve talked about production of rock phosphate. I'm going to talk more about the products themselves. The blue line on this graph represents nitrogen. Last year, there was just over 100 million tons of nitrogen sold and consumed in the world. Phosphate, which is traditionally reported as P2O5, there was just under 40 million tons, and potash close to 30 million tons. If you look at the projections that the International Fertilizer Industry Association puts forth, I've got this graphic here, this table is showing you that in 2009, the world consumed almost 160 million tons. And this year, it's forecast to increase. Because of the cost of fertilizer going up, there was a big dip in fertilizer usage around the world, and usage went down considerably. It is now starting to recover. Going out over the next 5 years, IFA is forecasting that total consumption of fertilizer is going to increase about 3.5%. If you look at phosphate, which is what we're very interested in today, it's going to be about 4.5% per annum. So it's a significant increase in use around the world because the demand continues to be very great. If you look at where the phosphate is currently being used, China, India, Brazil, and the United States, these 4 countries account for 70% of the consumption of phosphate around the world. Australia, Pakistan, Vietnam, Canada, Indonesia, Russia, they account for another 10%, and so the rest of the world only uses about 25% of the phosphorus. And Ann talked about Africa and how low the fertilizer usage is in Africa. It's less than 8 kilograms per hectare. That's included in the others, in many other countries where usage is quite low. And so there's great differences between the developed and the developing world and the amounts of phosphorus which is actually consumed, and the demand is still very great. Now, phosphorus is important. It's essential to plants and animal life. There is no substitute for us. And you can see on this particular slide, there's a whole host of things that phosphorus does in plants. It's involved in photosynthesis and energies. It's involved in cells. It impacts how roots grow and develop. It affects the quality of the produce. It impacts water use efficiency, and it helps crops mature faster. It's also critical to animals. In every cell in your body, there is phosphorus. Most of the phosphorus in animals is contained in the skeleton, in bones and teeth. But it's also important for lactation, and it's closely related to calcium when it comes to animals. So the demand is there because we can't produce food without phosphorus. Farmers are interested in phosphorus, of course, because it increases their yield. And there's many examples that you could look at, but this is a typical yield response that you might see in a phosphorus-deficient soil in wheat. Whereas you increase the phosphorus rate, you expect the yield to go up. Now, phosphorus is one of the 3 major nutrients, nitrogen and potassium and phosphorus. The responses to nitrogen tend to be much greater than phosphorus. So phosphorus doesn't produce the same results as nitrogen. Joanna mentioned that when she grew up, she could see lots of fertilizer-missing plants that looked yellow and dwarfed. Well, a phosphorus-deficient plant doesn't look yellow. It usually has a different color of green, and its growth might be stunted. In extreme cases, it might look a little purple. But for the most part, phosphorus behaves a little different than nitrogen, but it does increase crop yield, and that is very important to farmers. Most of the phosphorus in the crop is actually contained in the seed, not the straw. So every time, for example, on this slide, if you just look at the top line with maize or corn, if you produce a 9 ton per acre per hectare crop, you're going to remove about 21 kilograms per hectare of phosphorus in the seed. And that is exported from the land. Typically, it will go wherever the crop goes. So there's a lot of phosphorus that moves around the world in terms of the produce. And that's important in terms of how we manage phosphorus. I put this slide up. It's the same one that Steve showed that talks about fertilizer manufacturer, recognizing that rock phosphate is the raw material to produce phosphorus fertilizers. And I've got the chemical formula of a typical type of rock phosphate mineral, and it's surrounded by calcium and other ions, other elements, which tend to make the phosphate in the rock very unavailable. In some areas in the world, they can directly apply rock phosphate that is ground up and use it as a fertilizer if the soils tend to be quite acidic. It helps to release the phosphorus. But for the most part, we have to treat that rock phosphate with some sort of an acid to make it into a form that is available to a plant. And there's other impurities in rock phosphate. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard that rock phosphate contains heavy metals. They're there naturally present in the soil, and when the phosphorus is mined and it goes through a processing, a lot of the metals will go with the phosphate. Now we have the technology to take that out, and there's agronomic means to manage the heavy metal content in rock phosphate. It's one of the environmental concerns associated with phosphate, but we're able to manage that. So we make rock phosphate more available to the plant by treating it with acid. And we create these different types of fertilizers. Steve mentioned that diammonium phosphate and monoammonium phosphate represent about half the phosphate fertilizer used in the world. And they're available to the crop. In fact, the common phosphorus commercial fertilizers, they're highly water soluble compared to rock phosphate itself. Greater than 90% of the phosphate in the final fertilizer is soluble in water. And when you put that in the soil, it dissolves in the water, releasing orthophosphate ions. That is what the plant actually takes up. The chemistry of phosphorus in the soil, though, is very complicated. These ions interact with calcium and magnesium and iron and aluminum, and it is quite complicated in the soil. This is an example of a phosphorus cycle. And I just want you to notice around this central area of the cycle, the solution P, that's where the phosphorus is taken up by the plant. But that phosphorus can be interacting with all sorts of other things to render it less available to the crop. And so as soon as you put it in the soil, what doesn't get taken up by the plant is being transformed into other less available forms. You'll notice on here that this is showing that there's a little bit of phosphorus that can be leached. And I want to mention that because that is a very rare event, that you have phosphorus being leached. When that happens, it's through the soluble P that's present in the soil. Actually, phosphorus tends to be very immobile in the soil compared to nitrogen. That's one of the big issues with nitrogen, is that nitrogen can be leached and lost to groundwater. Phosphorus does not move. Compared to nitrogen and potassium, phosphorus moves very little. For example, if you had a corn root and a granule of phosphorus fertilizer was 1/4 of an inch from that root in a loamy textured soil, that phosphorus would never move close enough to that root to be picked up. So you're talking very small distances that phosphorus actually moves in the soil. So leaching is normally not a problem, but nitrogen moves quite readily, and this has an impact on some things I'll comment on in a moment. All nutrients tend to interact. They just don't behave by themselves, and we know that phosphorus interacts a lot with nitrogen in the soil. And this is an example with a corn crop. And you can see on this lower, the dotted line represents the yield curve in response to applied nitrogen that you'd expect with corn. And this is a 30-year average. This is some research that was done in the Midwest, here in the United States. The upper line represents when you add phosphorus, and you'll notice that as you add phosphorus, you increase the yield. These things work additively. But one of the things that happens when you add phosphorus and you increase the yield, you haven't changed the amount of nitrogen that is required to produce the maximum yield in the crop. In this case, it went from 161 pounds of nitrogen to 167. What that means is you're producing more crop with the same amount of nitrogen. So the nitrogen is being used more efficiently. So we know that phosphorus helps improve nitrogen use efficiency. This is the same data, this 30-year study, and what it's showing is the amount of nitrate nitrogen remaining in the soil profile. And you'll notice that when you add phosphorus, there is less nitrogen left in the soil profile. And when it's left in the soil profile, it's subject to being leached and lost to the environment and causing problems with our water. So phosphorus interacts with other nutrients. We always talk about the efficiency of fertilizers, and people will commonly say that phosphorus is a very inefficient fertilizer. They'll say that it often is only between 10 and less than 25% efficient. But the way that efficiency is calculated, you have to understand there's different terminologies, and I apologize for the mathematics, but this is quite simple. Efficiency is measured in this context as the amount of phosphorus or nutrient that is taken up by a crop that has been fertilized minus a crop that had no fertilizer applied to it or no phosphorus, divided by the fertilizer applied. So this is a measure of fertilizer efficiency. It's called the recovery percent. For example, if you fertilized a crop with 25 kilograms per hectare of phosphorus, and that crop in the seed removed 18 kilograms, and then you compared it to an unfertilized crop which removed 15 kilograms of phosphorus from the soil, you'd find out that the recovery efficiency was only 12%. And you'd immediately look at that and think, well, that's terrible. What happened to the other 88%? It's not getting in the crop. Well, this only applies to the year that you apply the phosphorus. And this works very well for nitrogen. This method of fertilizer efficiency measurement is common in nitrogen, and it's very appropriate, but it is not appropriate for phosphorus. And the reason is because nitrogen doesn't have any residual availability in the soil. The nitrogen that's left can be lost by leaching. You can lose it by denitrification or volatilization. It can go into the atmosphere. We're worried a lot about greenhouse gases and the contribution of nitrous oxide to greenhouse gases. That results when nitrogen in the soil gets volatilized. With phosphorus, the phosphorus not removed by the crop stays in the soil, and it's available for future crops. So the low efficiency is an artifact of the way that it's calculated. A couple of years ago, in 2008, our institute, in conjunction with the Fertilizer Institute, headquartered here in Washington, as well as the World Phosphate Institute out of Morocco, the International Fertilizer Association, and then FAO, commissioned a study with some scientists to look at the efficiency of phosphorus fertilizer. And the results of that study were published in a book. And basically what they found was that if you can maintain soils near their critical level for crop yield, phosphorus recovery, when calculated by a different method, more appropriate for phosphorus, it frequently exceeds 90%. Now, in contrast, the average recovery of nitrogen fertilizer around the world hovers between 30 and 40%. And if we could get nitrogen recovery up to 50%, everyone would be very pleased with that. So phosphorus recovery is much greater. I want to just spend another moment and talk about this idea of nutrient use efficiency terminology, because whenever you hear fertilizer efficiencies talked about, you have to understand what is the definition that they're using. So with this as some background, a crop that's had 20 kilograms per hectare of phosphate applied, because of the phosphorus, it yielded 3,100 kilograms per hectare of yield. Where no phosphorus was applied, it only yielded 26. The crop took up 20 kilograms of phosphorus. The unfertilized took up 17. So that's taken up in both the straw and the grain. But the removal was only 16. That's what we took away from the field in the grain. So there's a term called agronomic efficiency, which measures the yield increase versus the fertilizer applied. And in this case, applying 20 kilograms of phosphorus resulted in an increase of about 536 kilograms of yield. So the efficiency is 27 kilograms of grain for each kilogram of phosphorus applied. That's a common way to measure efficiency. Another common way is this recovery efficiency that I just used in a previous example. The efficiency in this case is only 15%. But a more appropriate way to look at phosphorus recovery is through this balance method. And this is where you look at the phosphorus that's actually removed from the crop relative to the fertilizer applied. And in this particular example, it works out to 80%. This particular term for recovery efficiency by the balance method is also known as the partial nutrient balance or the removal to use ratio. And I'll give you an example of it here in just a moment. So if you can imagine this crop that's calculated by the difference method at 15% recovery, the crop we applied 20 kilograms of phosphorus, you have to wonder what happens to the rest of the phosphorus. It stays in the soil. It gets incorporated into different phosphorus pools. And if you look at this diagram, when we do a soil test, we measure what's in the soil solution, and we measure other phosphorus pools that are close to the soil solution. It's very available to a crop. With time, the phosphorus goes in the direction to the left. It becomes more and more absorbed and less available to the crop. So what happens is that about 25% of the applied P stays in these available forms. The balance of it goes into less available forms, but it's still available to the crop. And so this recovery method for measuring it accounts for that availability. And it does remain available for a long time in the crop. And so I apologize for the technicality, but this is one of the big issues with phosphorus. People talk about it being very inefficient, and that is not the case. And you have to use the appropriate techniques to measure phosphorus availability. Let me give you a couple of examples here. This is some research which was just published last year in Science by a group where they looked at phosphorus nutrient balances in 3 different agricultural systems. One is low input corn or maize produced in Kenya. Another is a high input wheat corn double cropping system in North China versus a corn soybean rotation typical in the Midwest. It's actually in Illinois. And all of these cropping systems, because of the climate and the soils, have the same potential yield. However, the realized yield, or the actual yield that was produced by the farmers, were 2 tons in Kenya, 8.5 tons in China, and 8.2 tons in Illinois, and that's with maize. Okay. The phosphorus fertilizer that was applied in Kenya was 8 kilograms per hectare. The crop removed 7, so they had a net positive balance of +1. In North China, they applied 92 kilograms of phosphorus, much more than the crops need. Crop removed 39, they have a net balance of 53. So you've got this excess of phosphorus building up in the system. That's a problem in many areas of China. They're using too much fertilizer relative to what is agronomically needed. And then the situation in the Midwest, they applied 14 kilograms per hectare, but the crop removed 23. So you've got a negative situation. The crop is removing more than you're applying as fertilizer. When you calculate the recovery of that phosphorus, the efficiency of it, it's 88% in Kenya, 42% in North China, but 164% in the Midwest. What that is telling you is that in Western Kenya, where only the crop is removing, we're recovering 88% of what we've applied. In the Midwest, you've got a negative balance situation. And I'm using this as an example because we've recently published some information in our institute to try and look in the throughout the United States, what are the phosphorus and nitrogen and potassium recoveries based on fertilizer. And this particular study that we did uses census data every 5 years going back to 1987. And we're comparing the nutrients that were applied in fertilizer plus manure versus the nutrients which were exported in those crops. So this particular graphic is showing you the United States comparing 1987 to 2007. And what I'd like you to notice with the legend on this, when you see the green, the light green, and the greens, that indicates that crop removal is less than fertilizer use. We're building soil fertility. So the recovery ranges, if you look just here in the yellow area, 0.92. Compare it to 2007. You're seeing a shift where we're not building up soil fertility, but we're actually mining nutrients from the soil. We're depleting the soil. And that same area has gone from 0.92 to 1.27. So what we're seeing is that there's a shift in the budgets that are happening in this phosphorus recovery in the United States. And it's not the only country that we're seeing this in. This is just...
We're starting to run into Q&A time.
Okay. Let me just wrap this up very quickly. We have soil test information that supports the same type of information. We know our soil test values are declining, particularly in the last 5 years. We've just completed a study which is about to be released. Let me just make a comment and wrap up with some issues dealing with environment. You can't talk about phosphorus without bringing in the environment, because there's some big issues with environment, mainly related around eutrophication. That's the natural aging of lakes and streams, but when you add nutrients to that, you can accelerate that. And usually phosphorus is the limiting nutrient. And this particular picture just shows some research that was done in Canada where they added phosphorus to a system and really impacted the algae growth there. Here in the United States and around the world, hypoxia is a huge issue. In the Gulf of Mexico, here in the Chesapeake Bay, people are concerned about hypoxia. Phosphorus is involved in that. And we're always concerned trying to keep that phosphorus in the soil. As long as you don't have runoff of the soil, if the phosphorus sits on the surface, or if the soil gets moved, you can have these issues with hypoxia. And so the fertilizer industry is doing everything they can to try and combat that through applying fertilizer in the right place. They have a worldwide nutrient stewardship system based on applying the right source and the right rate at the right time in the right place of fertilizer within a farming system, which helps keep the fertilizer being used efficiently. And I'm not going to go into the details in this slide. I'll end with that, but the point is that the industry is very concerned about using nutrients efficiently. We're concerned about phosphorus because it is a finite resource. We know that there's lots of phosphorus left in the world, but we still have to do everything we can to keep it in place so it can be used by the crop and not make its way to our water systems where it can cause harm and damage. So with that, I'll stop and I thank you. Thanks, Joanna.
Well, thanks to all of our presenters. And today's presentations just remind me of how complicated and how technical and how many challenges and opportunities we face in farming and agriculture ahead. And we've got a lot of technical and scientific knowledge, and it's great to have these voices here today. We're going to enter into some Q&A here. I want to start out with a couple of quick questions, both to Amit and to Steve. First to Steve, if you can talk a little bit more about China's increase in reserves and production. What caused that? Why all of a sudden in the past 10 or 15 years did China really ramp up production? And then I want to ask Amit, I know this is phase 1 of your study and of your efforts. If you could talk a little bit more about the next phase, and then we'll open to the audience for questions.
Well, this is a matter of opinion, but I think China policy, they decided at some point in the 80s that they couldn't keep going the way they had. And they recycle a lot of organic matter there. They've been doing that for thousands of years. And they decided to get into the process fertilizer business as a way to increase their agricultural productivity. And subsequently, I think if you look back through all the data, they purchased a lot of fertilizer on the world market, and they kept ramping up their own capabilities. And they have a lot of rock there, and it's rock that's hard to beneficiate some of it. A lot of it, they have to direct mine a lot of it in the 30% range to make phosphoric acid and all these modern fertilizers. And another thing you have to remember is most of these deposits are in the middle of the country, and there's a lot of transportation costs. So as they bought fertilizer, they supplanted it with their own material they were making internally. And I think a lot of this is just information flow. There was just really nothing coming out of China until about 2000. There's very little information. And even today, what I've done, it's predicated on 2 or 3 reports that were reports given at IFA meetings. And there's some information through the IGCP, but it's very hard to nail down where the information exactly came from at one time or another. I think there's a language barrier, and then I think there was just the lack of information coming out of China.
Thank you, Joanna. Let me supplement Steve's comment with a couple of issues. We all recall in 1974, President Nixon went to China. Now, one of the things that came out of that trip was that China decided to order the world-class urea ammonia plant to make sure there was available nitrogen for crop production. And in 1978, there was a delegation that came from China to IFDC, and out of that, there were 2 engineers who came and stayed with IFDC for several years to essentially look at their own phosphate, develop the technology, and suddenly they went back, and of course, that was the start of it. Now, in terms of the second phase, this is, as Steve mentioned, this is the preliminary first phase. Our intention is to have the second phase, but it would be it would be a network of geologists, policymakers, scientists on a sustained basis. They would look at the new deposits that are being discovered and essentially populate the database. We had that in the 1990s when there was the whole debate about we're running out of phosphate. UNESCO created the International Geological Program, and that was very effective because there was a system to provide up-to-date information on the new deposits and availability of phosphorus. And our idea is to have that kind of a system available, or have the geologists from different parts of the world meet at least once a year to come with the new information so that we can update the information from time to time.
Thank you. Well, let's take a couple of questions at a time, and we'll start here. If you could just give your name and affiliation and use the microphone, and then we'll go to Kim next.
Yes, good morning. My name's Arno Rosemarin from Stockholm Environment Institute. I just happened to be in Montreal this week, so I could take the trip last night down here, and I'm very happy to be here. And I thank IFDC for this very useful report. I've been looking at the USGS data, I guess, for the last 10 years or so, and I'm one of the targeted peak phosphorus people in this study. I just have one. I'm very surprised, actually, to look at Table 7 on page 33. Because there's a message that is there that didn't come out in the presentation, and that is Morocco's reserve is being increased by something about from 5.7 megatons to 5,700 megatons. So it's 51 gigatons of it's about a 10 times increase. And I'm very surprised to see that data. It's a huge, absolutely huge increase in the estimate. I mean, it's something that I think you should have pointed out, because basically it explains why you have 60 gigatons of reserve in the total global assessment. It's the only one that's actually changed from the USGS data. I was just wondering why you didn't point that out. And the other one is I'm a bit concerned about how that data was actually derived, and I would but I haven't read the report, obviously. I haven't had time for that, but it's very important to know how you got to that data, and I think there's some calculations involved. It looks like there's some references that are 10 to 20 years back based on geological surveys. I'm just wondering if OCP has even refereed that data.
Okay, thank you. And Kim, let's take your question, and then we're going to go to the panel.
Yes, Kim Elliott with the Center for Global Development, and my question is maybe a little bit less relevant, since your research found that we may not be looming on peak phosphorus, so we may not be running out. Nevertheless, I wonder if anyone on the panel might be able to address the possibilities, the economic or other constraints on addressing both public health and food security through more healthful and sustainable human waste or other waste recycling, and combining sanitation with fertilizer production, and just sort of what the constraints or prospects for that might be.
Actually, if you go back to the tables, you'll find one or two cases where I came up with the exact numbers as the USGS, and there's quite a bit of variation, but the most substantial one is the Moroccan case. In 1998, a gentleman by the name of Garbi, who is the chief of mineralogy and beneficiation, the section or department of mineralogy and beneficiation at OCP, published an article in BRGM, Chronicles of Mining Research, and he identified 3 deposit areas as having identified reserves. And the BRGM has been doing economic studies on phosphate deposits since the turn of the century before, and I've read dozens of their reports, and they know what reserves are. They identified these 3 deposits. They identified the square meters of ore in various beds, and I recalculated them on a bulk density, and then I used appropriate ore to concentrate ratios for the various beds, and I came up with some numbers. And I was quite conservative in this because I only used the Caribga area and the Gontour area as reserves. There's another area called Mescala, which was explored with Russian assistance back, I think, in the late 70s and the 80s. And I did include Mescala because they've actually really made no move to develop that. I just left that aside as a resource. So I used what they had identified in their own literature. Actually, I think I'm quite conservative because in the original literature, it only indicated that 30% of the Gontour area was explored and less than 50%, I think 45% of Caribga area. So anyhow, I recalculated all this from the numbers they had given 15, 20 years ago, and then I subtracted out all the production as concentrate and ore from all these reserves that they had listed. And I'm very comfortable with the number, and I think it's a very good number. We had a review panel, 8 individuals, basically most of them from industry, reviewed all this, and it went in various directions. We had one reviewer that was from academia. I believe a lot of industry people looked at this, and we've had feedback, and no one has contested these numbers that has any direct knowledge of the reserves and resources.
Okay, thank you. And wait, let's just go to Kim's question now. We've got another question on the table. I'm not sure who the best person is to respond. Ahmed, are you the best person?
Well, I'll give it a try. You know, the issue of recycling of nutrient, I think, is very important. We all agree with it. The issue is recovering the nutrient vis-a-vis the cost and the other element that goes with it. There are new technologies that are being developed, and in fact, we are looking at a technology where you can dewater the sewage sludge and be able to convert that into a product that would be suitable for use. This has been tested in pilot plants, in large-scale pilot plant, and all the field trials, and there are also discussion going on in terms of how to take it commercial. But when you look at the sludge and the recycle, the nutrient content is such that the transportation in a larger distance becomes a big issue in terms of the cost factor. And so, you know, so it is a very site-specific issue, an issue that needs to be answered from many angles. The water is one of the more important one, the heavy metal content, the pathogens in it, and then there are also work going on in terms of supplementing that recovered nutrient from sewage sludge or other with the existing nutrient to make it a product which then it would be economical for transport. So to answer your question, there are a lot of work that is going on, and many companies and private individuals as well as universities are looking at way, but it all comes down to the economics of it.
And I just want to ask Ann a quick question. Ann, as you're looking at the Feed the Future initiative and you're receiving country plans, what are you seeing in terms of interest in inputs and fertilizer and information around inputs? Is there a trend that you see, or does this vary by country?
I think one of the most interesting insights that we're seeing coming out of these country plans is their, I guess, vision of their agricultural sectors as being commercial sectors, as trying to link farmers to markets. The sort of vision, romantic vision, I guess, that we've held for a long time and how we've addressed agriculture, you see countries beginning to realize that they need to move their smallholders into a more commercial market. And so with that, what we're seeing is an emphasis on improving yields. And, you know, it's a mix depending on the country, but there's you know, emphasis on increasing, you know, fertilizer use. But I would go back to the slide that I showed earlier. I think there's even more interest in the system around the farm and the extension and you know, farm management, all of those issues of which fertilizer is a part. I mean, we're seeing that much more systemic thinking even emerging from the country plans.
Well, thank you. Let's go back. Let's take the gentleman with the red tie and the gentleman with the striped tie after that. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Dick Rortvedt, retired from USDA. Back in the late 1970s, early 80s, I was the Economic Research Service International Fertilizer Economist, and we had a group called the World Bank, FAO, UNIDO Fertilizer Working Group. And we used all the resources that we could get our hands on, public and private, to try to forecast fertilizer supply and demand. And I just wanted to take one anecdote from that era to reinforce what you said, Steve, and that's getting the information out of China. We had the agricultural attachés do fertilizer reports back then. And those, of course, were public information. So FAO put out a survey and asked all the governments to fill out the fertilizer survey. And when we got it back, the numbers from China were exactly the numbers that had been reported by the USDA agricultural attaché in China. So anyway, yes, it was really hard to get information out of China. But I have a couple of questions. One, in the United States, Florida was our most important, I presume still is, our most important producing region for phosphate rock. And there's so many competing demands for land in Florida, for retirement, for agriculture, for recreation, and so on. What is the long-term viability of phosphate rock mining in Florida, and also, of course, concerns about environmental issues related to open pit mining and so on in Florida? And then number two, you showed the decline, and by the way, you did show we were very flat to down in production in the United States. So the other was, you showed how much decline there was in Russia. My question is, does that mean there's been a decline in the reserves or the quality, or is it just they haven't been mining it because they've been producing in the past primarily for domestic consumption and not oriented to the export market? Is there still potential for Russia to ramp up their production again if they were to find an economic outlet for their production?
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much. My name is Tom Herlihy. I'm with Land O'Lakes. This was a very rich presentation. I really appreciate the depth of scientific information we've gotten about fertilizer. But I would like to ask the Center for Strategic and International Studies to follow up on something that Ann was talking about. Right now, as these Feed the Future strategies are coming in, as countries in sub-Saharan Africa are developing the comprehensive plans for developing their ag sectors, I think there's a real need here for the US government to pull together the entire private sector to look at agricultural productivity in an integrated way. I think if you could pull together a panel with seed companies, because hybrid seed really needs fertilizer, crop protection companies, because guess what happens when you use fertilizer? It's not just the corn and the wheat that grows, the weeds grow. And who does all the agricultural labor in places like sub-Saharan Africa? It's women. Whereas if you use pre-emergent herbicides or post-emergent herbicides, you'll cut down on the need to do hoeing, which can damage plants. You will save water in the soil because you're not turning over the soil. So I would really urge you And I think there's a crying need for this, especially on the crop protection products, because USAID, as we know, has a lot of regulations around use of crop protection products in development programs overseas. I really applaud this panel. I've enjoyed the presentations, but I'd like to see a bigger picture with more private sector companies. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you for that comment. I'm happy to talk with you afterwards about what we might do, and I know Anne may have some comments as well. Oh, did you want to add something? Okay, go ahead.
Ademola Brimo is my name. I'm from the World Bank. I have a small question, and that pertains to what is the most effective strategy, I mean, a cost-effective strategy for addressing phosphorus deficiency problems in developing countries? What do you think?
Okay, let's have Anne start, and then let's turn to Dr. Roberts and to Steve to address your question and then the question about Russia's production.
First of all, I think that's an excellent suggestion. I spent the weekend reviewing a document that's being produced by a think tank in Europe. I'll just leave it at Europe. That was something of a breakthrough because this think tank actually did acknowledge the need for a more modern vision of agriculture, and that's not a typical point of view that this think tank might be espousing. However, it read very much as on the one hand and on the other hand, and one of the points that they made, which I took serious objection to, was the women's labor issue. And they essentially said, well, if we start using all these modern technologies, what will women do? And, so I think that how this all fits together and what will women do, hopefully more productive things and, in agriculture and more commercial things, is really, really an important issue, and it's something that's not, still not well understood. So.
It's interesting. It's kind of surprising. Very surprising. Okay, Terry and Steve, do you want to respond to the other two comments on the table or questions?
Just a comment to your question about what's the most efficient thing that we can do in Africa to increase production. Africa needs to use more fertilizer. They're only using less than 8 kilograms per hectare on average. And a small amount of fertilizer will increase production 3 to 4-fold using existing homegrown seed. And when you add hybrid seed to the mix, it jumps up another level. So dealing with the cost of the fertilizer and the access, those are all related issues. But a small amount of fertilizer will go a long way in Africa because the soils are so depleted and the amount that's used is, on average, so little. You'll get a big response to a small amount of nutrient.
Sorry, I think the question actually is how do we deal with costs?
We have been looking at the whole issue of cost. For the last, 2008, you saw the prices of fertilizer go up very, very high. Now, as far as Africa is concerned, if you break down the cost structure of fertilizer procured at the international and delivered to the farm, there are several components to it. The international procurement, there is very little any countries in sub-Saharan Africa can influence that. This is entirely supply-demand. The only two countries that can influence in the international prices are China and India because of the volume purchase that they do. What sub-Saharan Africa can do is when you look at sub-Saharan Africa, most of the fertilizer is imported, although it has the largest 60% of the world phosphate deposit is in Africa. But it imports a significant amount of fertilizer. And the real cost is the delivery from the port to the farm. And within that structure, the big chunk is the transportation cost. A fertilizer that is the same fertilizer that is imported into Thailand cost 50% less than delivered to the farmer in Tanzania. They both have coastal area, they import the fertilizer, and the important part is the cost of transportation. And then there are several items related to the dealers, the cost of financing. But as far as countries in Africa and other countries in Asia, I think the best way to do is how to improve the efficiency of its use. That's where we have control, and this is where I think is very important. How do you get the fertilizer and improve the efficiency of its use? You know, nitrogen being talked about, 30% is lost. There's a technology in Bangladesh they're doubling the efficiency of use, and that's within the control of the farmer. So I think we need to look at from the standpoint of how to improve the efficiency of use at the farm level, and that's where I think we can have the largest gain.
Steve, do you want to take the question about Russia's?
I'm not going to question about the U.S. and the Russian production. There's a figure in the paper, and it's by a USGS author. It was presented at in a paper in 2005 in Brazil, and it shows declining U.S. production, maybe 60% over the next 20 years, and perhaps no production from Florida in 50 years. This is based on existing reserves at that time, and as someone pointed out to me from the Florida Institute of Phosphate Research, the reserves down in Florida, the things that are mineable, no matter what the cost might be or the price of phosphate rock, they may be removed from consideration due to various other factors, such as legal considerations and laws. And mining is unpopular to some people in Florida, and that's just the way it is, and a lot of people have worked very hard, you know, to preserve their natural environment, and this is all worthwhile and not for me to judge, but I have maps that show there's twice as much land as they have permitted right now, for instance, in the southern Florida extension, and these lands are potentially mineable, or a good part of them, because they're not developed. There's other lands in Florida on the east side of the Lake Wales Ridge where the phosphate resources are fairly deep, and North Florida, where they could use things like borehole mining, and they're underneath cattle ranches and things, and they could, when they borehole mine, they go down, they wash it out and suck it up the tube, and then they beneficiate it, and then they put it back down, so that minimal settling. Going from Florida, if the price of phosphate rock gets high enough, there's places out west where they could go underground. Russia, back when all the transitions were going on in the Soviet Union, they were at a point with Kabini where they were having to go underground, and they needed all kinds of investment, and their internal market just went poof, gone. You know, more than half of their market was gone, and if you look at it pretty carefully, their export market, which was somewhere on the order of 8 million tons, it maintained itself, but if you look carefully, they had to go underground, and whatever, they were moving like 4.5 or 5 tons of rock for every ton of concentrate they produce. Now they have to move like 9.5 tons for every ton of concentrate. So they use their existing resources, and their production's cut less than half, and presumably they've made some investments, but they've been, you know, asking people to do this for years, and I don't know if it's happened quite the way. They have identified some more resources, ore bodies, and there's been bidding on ore bodies in the last couple of years. What's been mined has been mined, and who knows what's around the area, but it's fairly extensively explored. There's other deposits in the Soviet Union that are not mined right now because of the economy and lack of demand, and some of these are firing up, and I'm sure there's probably even more we don't know about.
Great. Well, let's take one last round of questions before we close up. Gentleman in the back.
Hi, my name is Fanky from Government Accountability Office. I just have a question for Ann on Feed the Future. There seems to be a lot of coordination among USDA and USAID at the highest levels in DC, but then what kind of mechanisms will you have at the ground to have coordination between USDA field offices and USAID missions? in country.
Okay, any other questions? You want to ask one last question? Microphone's on the way.
Just a little about the future of this this study, the phosphorus study that IFDC has done. There's a phase 2 that's coming up to it, but I'm very concerned that we're blowing off the peak phosphorus debate based on some calculations on the Moroccan reserves that have not been explored yet. And to take responsibility for this, I think it's necessary to do something more. And there is no UN agency that's monitoring rock mining. And obviously the USGS data is questionable from this report. So what, from this meeting, are we going to make, what message do we have to the world about, because next year this report will be forgotten. We need to put this, we have to inform the world as to the progress of this. Otherwise we'll be back here again talking about peak phosphorus in a year.
Okay, we'll have Ann start, and then maybe Amit, you can respond to the last question.
So I'm going to answer the question, and then I have to leave before maybe this closes up because I'm due on the Hill for another speech. Actually, my other speech is going to say exactly the opposite of what you just said. I think that the cooperation at the very high levels in Washington is going very well. And actually, we do have a mechanism that is being put in place in each of the missions, where a coordinator will be named for global food security. In some cases, that will be a USAID person. In other cases, it might be a State Department person or even a USDA person, whoever is the most suited to that role. And those people, we already are seeing tremendous benefit in Africa, where those people have started to work, and they are really pushing a more whole-of-government function at the mission levels, at the embassy levels. It's challenging for some agencies like USDA because we are not in every single country that's going to be a focus country for this initiative, and that's something we're trying to confront. But I would say the bigger challenge is actually the middle level of players in Washington who have, you know, their stovepipes, their standard operating procedures, their institutional jealousies and histories and whatever. That is going to be challenging. You know, it's going to be a longer-term process of changing how we function, changing cultures, and that's really difficult. But I think at the mission level, I see great progress, actually. I don't know if that started in Cambodia as yet, if we're seeing that in Cambodia, but the reports I'm hearing from Africa, Bangladesh, and Haiti, things are moving pretty well.
Well, Ann, I know you have to go, but thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your comments. And good luck with your next session. Amit, we'll ask you to respond to the last question in terms of follow-up.
That's a very good question, what you had, Arno. As I said, you know, we undertook this study because of the information and the new articles that kept on coming. And in this regard, we are extremely grateful to USAID for giving us the money to take this as a part of a bigger initiative called the Virtual Fertilizer Research Center. Now, if we go back and look at the reason as to why there was this series of articles that were put out, was because the data information or the reserved data that were used were not updated. Okay, we faced the same thing in the early 80s, and the UNESCO started this 10-year study where they got together the geologists from around the world and financed and started to repopulate the database so that the information were very current. And our idea is that we can start that process again, a loose coalition of geologists, policymakers, and the people from the country start to come together once a year or once every 2 years, but work on a virtual setting to give more information. And the important part is that if we have more current information on the new deposits and the additional information on the existing deposit, that we should be able to analyze and be much more pragmatic in terms of our conclusions, and subsequently then this can be used by the policymaker for the future policies.
Well, thank you. We have a lot of meetings at CSIS, but it's rare that we have such an expert panel and such a rich discussion. So I want to thank our panelists and thank you to IFDC for coming here to release your report. Also, we have some time in the room, and IFDC has actually provided some refreshments, so I hope you'll stay around. And I do want to note that if I ran the show, nothing would ever happen. So we rely on Kristen Wedding and Kate Thompson and Brett Baptist, who helped us pull together this discussion. We'll have sessions upcoming. We're also going to post this session on our website, on IFDC's website, and I think on your website as well. So if you want to go back and take a look, you can find it there. We'll also do a little podcast, audio podcast that you can access as well. So thanks for coming, and enjoy your day and enjoy something to eat and drink.